Paris is a city of masks. Walk along the Seine today and you will see the grand boulevards of Haussmann, the iron lace of the Eiffel Tower, the pale limestone facades that glow like honey in the afternoon light. It is a city that knows it is beautiful, and it wears that beauty like armor. But strip it all away, tear back the wide avenues and the gaslit cafes and the monument to every emperor and revolution. Beneath it all lies a different city entirely, a city of mud and miracle, of plague and prayer, of fishmongers and philosophers packed so tightly into an island in the middle of a river that the walls themselves seem to breathe. For centuries, the true face of medieval Paris has been buried under centuries of reconstruction, revolution, and renovation. We have relied on illuminated manuscripts and the crumbling margins of old chronicles to imagine its towers, its filth, its impossible energy, until now. By fusing historical records with the power of modern artificial intelligence, we have peeled back the layers of time. We are not just telling you the story of the past, we are rebuilding it. Paris in the medieval era was not a capital in the way we understand the word today. It was a pressure cooker. It was a wound that kept growing. At its heart sat a small teardrop of land in the middle of the river Seine, the Ile de la Cité, the ancient cradle of the city. This was where everything began. The Romans had built here, the Frankish kings had ruled here, and by the 12th century, it was the most densely populated patch of earth in the Western world. On this island, tens of thousands of people lived on top of one another in a tangle of timber and ambition. The streets were barely wide enough for two men to pass shoulder to shoulder. The houses leaned so far over the alleys below that neighbors on opposite sides could reach out their windows and shake hands. Sunlight was a luxury. For most Parisians, the sky was a thin gray ribbon glimpsed between the overhanging stories of buildings that groaned and creaked in the river wind. To enter the city, you crossed one of the great bridges, and the bridges of medieval Paris were unlike anything the modern world has kept. They were not empty stone crossings over water. They were streets suspended above the Seine, lined from end to end with shops, mills, and houses. The Pont au Change, named for the money changers who crowded its length, was a city within a city. The noise on these bridges was extraordinary. The grinding of the water mills bolted to the stone piers below, the shouting of merchants, the lowing of cattle being driven to slaughter, the bells of a dozen nearby churches all colliding in the damp river air. And beneath you, the Seine itself, brown and fast and full of everything the city threw into it. The lifeblood and the sewer of Paris rolled into one, dominating everything on that island, rising from its westernmost point with a confidence bordering on arrogance, was Notre-Dame de Paris. We know it today as a wounded monument, still recovering from the fire that tore through its roof. But in the medieval era, it was something altogether more overwhelming. Construction had begun in 1163, and for generations the Parisians had lived with the sound of chisels and the shadows of scaffolding as their constant companions. By the 14th century, it stood complete, and it was not merely a church. It was a statement of supreme ambition carved in stone. The twin towers rose nearly 70 meters into the sky, visible from every corner of the city and from miles out across the flat plains of the Île-de-France. The facade was a theater of theology. Every surface was alive with carved figures, kings and saints and demons and angels locked in their eternal positions, staring down at the population below with an expression that was impossible to read as anything other than judgment. The great rose windows caught the light in ways that seemed to defy the nature of stone and glass, flooding the interior with rivers of color that moved across the floor like living things. For a medieval Parisian, entering Notre Dame was not a matter of cultural tourism. It was an encounter with the infinite. The scale was designed to make the human body feel precisely what it was in that world: small, temporary, and utterly dependent on something far larger than itself. But Paris was never just a city of God. It was, with increasing insistence, a city of knowledge. On the southern bank of the Seine, the left bank, a different kind of power was taking root. The University of Paris, which would become one of the great universities of the medieval world, drew scholars from across Europe into the narrow streets of what would eventually be called the Latin Quarter, named for the language in which all learning was conducted. Here, in cold rented rooms above taverns and workshops, young men from England and Italy and Germany sat hunched over manuscripts, arguing theology and philosophy by the light of tallow candles. The streets around them were alive with the specific chaos of a student city. Cheap wine, loud arguments, the occasional knife fight, and the constant presence of the book trade, copyists and parchment sellers clustered around the university like barnacles on a hull. Paris was becoming, alongside its role as the seat of the French monarchy, the intellectual capital of Europe, and the tension between those two identities, the sacred and the secular, the royal and the scholastic, ran through every stone of the city. North of the river, on the right bank, the city spread in a different register entirely. This was the world of commerce, of trade, of the marketplace. At its heart lay Les Halles, the great central market of Paris. If Notre-Dame was the soul of the city, and the university was its mind, then Les Halles was its stomach. The market occupied a vast open space that had grown organically over generations. Stall pressed against stall, trade bleeding into trade, the smell of fresh bread mingling with raw fish and horse dung, and the sharp iron smell of the butcher's quarter. By dawn, the roads leading into the market were already choked with carts bringing produce in from the surrounding countryside, vegetables from the fertile gardens to the south, grain from the flat plains to the north, fish hauled through the night from the coast and from the rivers. The noise was deafening before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, and threading through all of it, the market inspectors, men whose job was to enforce the strict rules of trade, because in a city this size, in a world without refrigeration or regulation, the difference between honest commerce and rotten fraud could be the difference between a neighborhood surviving the winter and a neighborhood starving. Above it all, on the right bank's northern edge, loomed the fortress of the Louvre. Unlike the Tower of London, which announced its menace in pure white stone, the medieval Louvre was a darker proposition. Built at the end of the 12th century by Philippe Auguste as a military stronghold to protect the city from attack from the west, it was a severe and functional thing, a round donjon tower surrounded by a square defensive wall with towers at each corner. There was nothing ornamental about it. It was a weapon pointed at anyone who thought Paris was vulnerable, and it sat outside the city walls at the time of its construction, a guardian standing watch at the threshold, a reminder that beyond the bridges and the markets and the cathedral, the world was dangerous, and power required stone to hold it, because the walls themselves were everywhere in medieval Paris. Philippe Auguste, that restless transformative king, had encircled the city with a continuous ring of fortifications in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, punctuated by towers and gates, a physical membrane that separated the city from everything outside it. The Porte Saint-Denis, the Porte Saint-Martin, each gate was a theater of control. To pass through was to submit to inspection, to pay toll, to announce yourself. The gates were closed at night. Paris after dark was sealed inside itself, and the streets that had been merely dangerous during the day became genuinely lawless after the bells of curfew rang across the rooftops. Those streets. To walk through medieval Paris was to navigate a city that had grown without plan or mercy. There was no grid, no logic of avenue and boulevard that the later centuries would impose by force. The streets followed the paths of ancient tracks and the whims of whoever had built there first. They were mostly unpaved, or paved in patches, channels of filth running down their centers carrying the contents of chamber pots emptied from the upper windows each morning. The cry of warning, the shouted heads below, was not a courtesy but a legal requirement that was, by all accounts, only loosely observed. The smells of the city were layered and total. Tanneries and slaughterhouses operated within the walls. The dyer's quarter turned the tributary streams vivid, poisonous colors. Pigs ran loose through certain neighborhoods, officially employed as a kind of organic waste disposal system, owned by the monks of Saint Antoine and allowed to roam freely in exchange for keeping the streets marginally cleaner than they would otherwise be. And yet, people wrote poetry here. People fell in love in these alleyways, made fortunes in these markets, argued about the nature of God and the movement of the stars in these cold stone lecture halls. The medieval Parisian did not experience their city as a place of darkness and deprivation in the way we might imagine looking back across the distance of centuries. They experienced it as the world, complete and total, the only world most of them would ever know. The bells of Notre-Dame marking the hours, the river always audible somewhere beneath the noise of the streets, the seasonal processions of the church moving through the city like slow rivers of color and incense. This was life, entire. The city that AI has helped us reconstruct is not a ruin, and it is not a museum. It was a living organism, contradictory and overwhelming, holy and filthy, brilliant and brutal all at once. The narrow streets in the great cathedral, the student taverns in the king's fortress, the market at dawn, and the sealed gates at night. This was medieval Paris, not a dream of the past, a city as real and as urgent as the one that stands in its place today, buried deep beneath the boulevards, waiting to be remembered. This is where the story ends. But Paris never really ends. Walk the city today, and you are walking on top of a ghost. The wide boulevards that Haussmann carved through the medieval fabric in the 19th century, those long surgical cuts of stone and light that gave modern Paris its famous geometry, were not built on empty ground. They were built on top of a world. Houses were demolished by the thousands. Streets that had existed for 8 centuries were erased in an afternoon. The people who lived in those narrow alleys, the tanners and the fishmongers, and the students arguing philosophy over cheap wine, were pushed outward, scattered, forgotten. And in their place came the Paris that tourists photograph today. Elegant, ordered, deliberate. A city that looks like it was always meant to be exactly this way. It was not. What we have shown you in this reconstruction is not a fantasy. It is not a painter's romantic imagining of a simpler time. Every alley, every market stall, every stone buttress and timber frame is grounded in the record that survives, the tax rolls and the court documents, the illuminated manuscripts where a careful artist painted the city's skyline in the margin of a prayer book, the archaeological excavations that have pulled fragments of medieval Paris out of the ground every time the city digs a new metro line or sinks a foundation. The bones of the old city keep surfacing. They refuse to stay buried. And what those bones tell us is something that should stop us in our tracks. Because the people who lived in this city were not primitive. They were not stumbling through darkness, waiting for the Renaissance to arrive and rescue them from ignorance. They were solving the same problems that every city has always faced. How do you feed 100,000 people? How do you keep the water clean enough to drink? How do you regulate the markets so that the poor are not cheated by the rich? How do you balance the power of the church against the power of the crown, against the power of the merchants who hold the purse strings of everything? How do you build something that will last? They answered those questions in stone. Notre-Dame stood for 8 centuries before the fire of 2019 took its spire. 8 centuries. The medieval engineers who designed those flying buttresses, who calculated the thrust of those arches without computers or engineering degrees, who worked in cold stone with cold hands and solved problems of physics through intuition and trial, and accumulated knowledge passed from master to apprentice across generations. Those men built something that outlasted every political system, every plague, every revolution, every war that the following centuries could throw at it. That is not the achievement of a primitive civilization. That is the achievement of human beings at the full height of their capabilities, working with the tools and the knowledge they had. The University of Paris produced thinkers whose arguments we are still having. The debates about faith and reason, about the nature of authority, about what a human being owes to God and to the state and to other human beings, those debates that were shouted across cold lecture halls on the left bank in the 13th century, are not settled. They are the debates of this morning's newspaper. The medieval scholars did not have our answers, but they were asking our questions. The markets of Les Halles fed a city in an era before refrigeration, before global supply chains, before the infrastructure that makes modern urban life possible. The guilds that controlled those markets were brutal monopolies by our standards, closed shops that protected their members at the expense of everyone outside. But they were also the mechanism by which quality was maintained, by which skills were passed down, by which a young man from the countryside could arrive in the city with nothing and, through years of work and learning, become a master of his craft, with a place in the world and a name that mattered in his neighborhood. It was an imperfect system. Every system is imperfect. But it was a system that worked well enough to sustain one of the largest cities in the medieval world for centuries. We should not romanticize this. The medieval city was a place of genuine and daily suffering for most of the people who lived in it. The child mortality rates were devastating. The plagues that swept through those narrow streets, with the houses pressed together and the water supply contaminated, and no understanding of how disease moved from body to body, killed in numbers that are almost impossible to absorb. The Black Death of the 14th century killed somewhere between a third and a half of the population of Paris in months. Think about what that means. Think about what it means to lose half of everyone you know in a single season. The grief alone would have been incomprehensible, and yet the city survived. The markets reopened. The students came back to the lecture halls. The cathedral bells kept ringing across the river. Human beings are, among other things, extraordinarily difficult to finish. The poor of medieval Paris lived lives of physical hardship that we cannot fully imagine. Cold that seeped through the walls of timber houses in January. A diet that depended entirely on what the harvest had done that year. Legal systems that offered the powerful enormous protection and the powerless almost none. Violence that was casual and public and rarely punished if the person committing it had enough money or the right bloodline. We should not pretend otherwise. We should not look at those reconstructed streets and see only the picturesque. But we should also not look at those streets and see only misery, because something was alive in this city that is worth paying attention to. There was a density of human experience in these narrow alleys, a proximity to other lives, a shared noise and shared smell and shared knowledge of your neighbors that modern urban life has largely traded away for space and privacy and speed. The medieval Parisian knew the baker on their street by name. They knew which fishmonger was honest and which one had been pilloried last month for selling rotten stock. They knew the sound of every bell in every nearby church and could tell the time by listening. They were embedded in a web of human relationships and mutual obligations and local knowledge that gave their lives a texture, a groundedness, a sense of belonging to a specific place that many people in modern cities spend their whole lives searching for and never quite finding. What artificial intelligence has allowed us to do in this project is something that would have seemed like genuine magic to a medieval Parisian, which is a thought worth sitting with. We have taken fragments, scraps of text, archaeological data, architectural analysis, the careful work of historians across generations, and we have used a technology that none of those historians could have imagined to assemble those fragments into something that breathes. Not perfectly, not completely. There are gaps in this reconstruction, places where the evidence runs out and informed judgment takes over, and we have been honest about that throughout. But for the first time, it is possible to stand in a version of this city that no living human has ever seen, to look up at the twin towers of Notre-Dame before the spire was added, before the centuries of weathering softened the sharpness of the carving, to look down a market street at dawn and understand in your body, not just in your mind, what the scale of this place actually was. History is not a collection of dates and names. It is the accumulated weight of human decisions made by people who were, in all the ways that matter, exactly like us. Frightened and ambitious and funny and cruel and capable of extraordinary tenderness and extraordinary violence, often in the same afternoon. Medieval Paris was built by those people. It was lived in by those people. And it was lost, gradually and then suddenly, to time and fire and the relentless human desire to tear down what exists and build something new in its place. But it was here. It was real. And now, for the first time in centuries, you have seen it.